Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon. My name is Erica Davies. I'm the Director of External Affairs for ABFE. And welcome to Who Manages the Money, How Foundations Can Help Democratize Capital. We appreciate your joining us this afternoon for the conversation that we will be having today, and invite you all to participate in a conversation, at least an online one. So before we get started, I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping items. First of all, everyone is in listen mode currently, but just in case you didn't enter your audio pin, that we can keep everyone's phone on mute. We just ask that you actually mute your own line, just as a double check on background noise during the webinar. We also ask that you not put your phone on hold if you have to leave your desk or have a conversation in the office. We just ask again that you put the phone on mute, not on hold, so that we don't hit hold music on the webinar. And then finally, when we open up the webinar for questions, and actually along the way, as things occur to you, please use the panel on the side of your screen to type in any questions, and we'll be sure to get those read during the course of the webinar. Most likely at the end of it, we'll enter into a discussion for an opportunity for Q&A. So with those few housekeeping items, we will go ahead and get started. Again, thank you for joining us for Who Manages the Money, How Foundations Can Help Democratize Capital. My name again is Erica Davies. I'm with ABFE, so I will start off talking about some of our work in this space. But I'm also very pleased to have with us Thurman White, who is the CEO of Progress Investment Management Company. He is also the author of the white paper that preceded this particular webinar, Who Manages the Money. So let me go ahead and get started so we can hear from Thurman and learn more about the work that the Kellogg Foundation has done to increase diversity of its investment managers. Just really quickly about ABFE, again, we were founded in 1971 to promote effective and responsive philanthropy in Black communities. Just earlier this week on the 17th, we celebrated our birthday, our anniversary. November 17th is when our Articles of Incorporation were signed. To date, we have over 300 individuals through institutional and individual memberships that we count as being representatives or being represented by ABFE on issues of importance in Black communities. We do our work in 4 primary areas: is advocacy, networking and convening, knowledge, training and technical assistance, and professional development. The work that we have undertaken in support of engaging more minority managers and foundation endowment management falls under our advocacy bucket, where we are advocating for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in this field. So why does this matter? Why does engaging diverse managers even matter? Why should it matter to the field, and why should it matter to us who advocate for these issues? So we'll start with, it's a way of, again, meeting diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Most of the foundations that we work with either have an explicit policy, it's explicit in their values or their principles of the foundation, or even just embedded in the work that they do or in their mission, that we are seeking more equitable outcomes in society, that we are working towards goals of diversity within our work or in our foundation. This is an area that no one has really talked about as being ripe for more inclusive practices. So it just presents another opportunity for our foundations to meet their goals. This is a way of building wealth in communities of color. When we look at even just taking the top 100 foundations, for example, if you look at the Foundation Center's listing of top 100 foundations by asset size, there's always over $270 billion in wealth that's represented there in assets. Just an implied look at what the manager fees from that would be is close to $2.7 billion every year. And so if minority managers aren't accessing those opportunities, they're not accessing the opportunities to generate their wealth as well. We look at this as an opportunity also to develop pipelines of talent, not just in the investment manager field, where we have found that minority managers, women managers tend to hire people of color and women within those firms and give them opportunities to manage money, to run research, to get the experience that they need. This work is like an apprenticeship. You don't just say, I'm going to open a private equity firm if you haven't had the experience. So it's a way of developing pipelines for future talent, but also a way of developing pipelines for leadership in our own field. So whether it's as a chair of an investment committee or simply being a board member, these are individuals who have accomplished a great deal in their professional space, have information, have experience, have talent to bring to the foundation space as well. So generating those pipelines becomes an important aspect of this work. And then finally, the philanthropy that can be generated. When we look at the managers excuse me, that we have encountered and asked about their philanthropic support, very often it's going to the communities that they care about, communities that we all care about. So we're generating new philanthropists when we're building wealth in these different communities. So when we talk about this, we're talking about an intentional strategy. So take it to the next slide. For ABFE, and very often you'll hear these terms used interchangeably. We talk about explicitly minority and women managers, and that refers to firm ownership and decision making that is at least 51% with a minority or a woman. Very often we'll also hear the term emerging managers used. That can refer to a lot of different aspects. And originally that term was one of underrepresented managers, but it has expanded. And so it talks about, boutique firms or a track record that may be less than 5 or 7 years or AUM under a certain amount. But the ownership composition isn't expressly identified or defined when you hear the term emerging manager. So sometimes it'll be used interchangeably. I just wanted to be clear for ABFE's point of view that we're explicit about minority and women-owned firms. Earlier this year, we released a paper called the Hardest Taboo to Break, and that was something that was drafted by Dr. Emmett Carson of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and Michael Miller of Colonial Consulting. And in that paper, Dr. Carson identified just a number of the challenges that he has had as a leader in the field of moving the needle on this. Before we released that paper, actually, we had done our own research and identified a number of the barriers that either managers had identified or even foundation colleagues had identified to greater participation or greater inclusion. I won't go all the way through this. Again, these slides will be made available. But when we talk about barriers, we're talking about the systemic issues that prevent more inclusive practices. So that can very often be policies and practices. Just a misperception of decision makers around higher risk factors. There's simply limited access to where the minority investment managers are in different asset classes. Firms themselves don't have necessarily the resources available to enter into the spaces where they can be more visible. It's very often an expensive proposition to be visible in the spaces where foundation or other institutional investors are. Developing those long-term relationships. Very often the relationships that exist with managers have been in existence for years, and in some cases, if not decades. So having to disrupt long-term relationships or establishing them. And identified in the Hardest Taboo to Break was simply implicit bias. Will I have to suffer a loss of performance if I decide that I'm going to be intentional about working with minority or women-owned firms? And that's a bias that people bring to that space because that's not who's always seen managing the money. Excuse me. And then finally, some of the consultants are seen as gatekeepers. Not that they are absolutely preventing the opportunity, but they are not either being pushed by their clients or not being challenged to establish more inclusive practices themselves. And so someone once told me, don't bring me an alligator unless you plan to feed it. So it's easy to identify a whole lot of challenges, but then we also wanted to identify some recommendations for moving the needle on this issue as well. Excuse me. And to that point, some of them are just being very intentional and explicit about establishing policies. We want to be inclusive in our investment management practices. And it's very simple to put those statements in your policy statement. And that way, we're all thinking, and we're going to be more intentional about what we do. Establishing metrics for your staff, for committees, or for consultants towards showing or demonstrating that they are making moves in this way, in this effort. So that might be how many meetings are being held, how many conferences, are you speaking on panels, are you finding ways of intentionally engaging minority and women-owned firms. Exploring platforms that offer exposure to minority and women-owned firms. So we'll hear later from Thurman White, and Progress Investment Management Company is an example of one of those platforms, but there are various ones that meet the needs in different asset classes that can help foundations to establish those relationships. Again, monitoring relationships with consultants to ensure that their process is as inclusive as possible. 3 of the questions that came out of the hardest taboo to break were focused on how consultants are expanding opportunities for managers. So what are you doing, or how are you tracking them? What is your research process, and is it leading to minority managers being recommended for other clients, not just the one client? And then how many of those clients are actually then taking those recommendations and picking up those managers for investment purposes. So challenging the status quo so that we are generating more opportunity for these firms. Getting to know the organizations that are focused on supporting minority and women-owned firms. So there's the Association of Asian American Investment Managers. There's NAS, National Association of Securities Professionals, NEIC, New America Alliance. So there are a number of organizations that can help identify managers and help think about how to move forward with this work. Simply attending conferences and events, or encouraging collaborative business models between consultants, and again, those platforms that I mentioned earlier. And I know that Thurman will talk a little bit more about that, please. So what has ABFE been doing to move this particular agenda? We started our smart investing work, we call it smart investing, about 2, almost 3 years ago now, with the express purpose or the intent in mind of identifying sort of the supply and the demand. How do we address some of those barriers that we've identified to make sure that we are focused on carrying the message, carrying the water, that this is an important aspect of foundation practice, and then allowing the managers themselves to come into that space so that they aren't carrying that water, that they are simply talking about the work, their performance, their process, that they can be viewed for the outstanding work that they are doing. And so again, we created or launched our Smart Investing Initiative with really four ways of trying to get this work done. So producing and distributing relevant information in the field of philanthropy. So papers like The Hardest Taboo to Break or Who Manages the Money, and offering opportunities like this webinar. Making sure that we're hosting, facilitating education and networking forums. We've held about 3 events at this point over the past 3 years that were opportunities for foundations to learn more, for managers to understand the foundation space, and for them to come together just to get to know or to start to build those relationships. We've also, this year, I'm very pleased to say that we've produced a directory of minority and women-owned investment management firms. This is our attempt to break down the barrier of we don't know where to find them. Very often we would hear from some of our colleagues in the field, well, that's great, I'd love to do more, but we don't know where to find them. We don't know how to source those particular managers. So we decided that we would try to help with that, and created what we call our industry partner affiliation, by which managers can join ABFE, and then they are listed in the directory. So they're coming into our work with the intent of obviously being seen by potential investors with the foundation, But they also start to learn more about the work that ABFE does in general, and it's our hope that they will participate in our work to support Black communities through effective and responsive philanthropy. So we're hoping to get a twofer out of that particular opportunity. So very quickly, I'll run through so you can see a couple of pages from our Smart Investing Directory. Excuse me, the online submission form that managers can complete to provide more than just basic contact information. We wanted managers to know that we were serious about getting their information to foundations. We wanted the foundations to be able to say, okay, well, we're actually looking for a hedge fund manager. It doesn't do them any good if they don't know which ones are potentially there. So we've given an opportunity for managers to put not just their contact information in, but also some performance information, very basic, but also some information about their firm history and profile, and also a description of their strategy. So you'll see here, this is just a sample page from the directory. In addition to our directory, we, again, have been trying to share as much knowledge as possible, sharing resources. So this is, if you haven't seen it before, Investment Manager Diversity, The Hardest Taboo to Break was released in February of this year. Foundation Investment Management Practices, Thoughts on Alpha and Access to the Field was released in late 2012. Again, that one identifies a number of the barriers that we'd heard from, again, foundations and managers, but then also some recommendations for starting to address. And finally, what we're learning is that we're very pleased to know that there's an appetite for learning more about how to invest with this new talent for foundations. When we started this work, we felt that it was the right thing to do, but the reception that we've received in the field has been actually very encouraging, that foundations are wanting, or decision makers, I shouldn't just say foundations, but decision makers are wanting more information and wanting to understand how can we be more inclusive in this particular space of the work that we do, which has not always been up for discussion around conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're also learning that increasing diversity at the leadership levels is creating very new perspectives on this issue. So as diversity is increased at the trustee level or within decision-making at the staff level, that they're bringing new ideas and thoughts around this particular issue. That we've got to establish our advocates at the board level, and I think Derm will talk about this as well, but when the board is brought into this, to this idea, that that's when we really see a lot more movement, that the advocates at that level will ask the questions of the investment committee, will challenge the consultant, will establish or try to establish those metrics within the staff to ensure that these decisions not only are being made on sort of the basis of, okay, we're up for review right now of our managers, but this is embedded in the work of the foundation. Excuse me. Many foundations view this as an opportunity to access performance first, and then a path to their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals second. And that's encouraging because we know that the managers that are out here, they are performers. That's not to say that all managers are performing, but it is to say that there are a number. There are certainly a minority of women-owned firms that are performing or outperforming their majority and larger peers. And so we've got to create pathways for accessing that talent. And finally, this is new territory, and it's a new approach for our colleagues in the philanthropic sector. Because this is new territory, some folks are a little hesitant to step into this space, but I have been grateful for the information I know that we've been sharing, and are starting to make connections to think about how they can, again, be more inclusive in their investment management practices. So with that, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Thurman White, who, again, was the author of the case study that has brought us to this webinar, to talk more about progress as well as their work with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. So, Thurman.
Thank you, Erica, and let me also just thank ABFE and also, most importantly, our listeners for taking time out from their busy schedules to join us today to really engage in a dialogue around an important issue. I want to thank ABFE for just your leadership, the smart investing initiative that you described in your slides prior to mine, and just the passion with which you have brought to this issue, I think has helped to stimulate dialogue. As Erica mentioned, I'm president and CEO of Progress Investment Management Company based here in San Francisco, and that's the primary hat that I come before you with this morning. But I'm also a part of the foundation community, if you will, in a broader sense, since I serve on the board of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which has become the largest community foundation in the United States with a little more than $6 billion in assets. And so I do serve on that investment committee, so I've had a first-hand opportunity to work with our CEO and board, CEO Dr. Emmett Carson, as well as our investment consultant, Colonial. So I'll probably share some of the experiences we've had as well. But primarily, I come today to share with you the experiences that we've had with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and really adding to the dialogue that ABFE has initiated here around how to incorporate diverse minority and women investment managers, best in class, I should say, minority and women investment managers into managing foundation portfolios. Just a word about Progress. We are in our 24th year of business. We are in many ways a diversity pioneer in the investment management space. And exclusively what we've done is invest with emerging managers throughout our 24-year history. Our firm itself, 35 employees, diverse employee body, 9 owners, all of which are minority and women. Over 80% of our employees are ethnic minorities and or women. So diversity is also something that's embedded as a core value at Progress. We manage $8.7 billion in assets for institutional clients, and again, we specialize as a multi-manager specialist with emerging managers. And Erica's done a good job of providing a definition. Emerging managers is a term of art, an umbrella phrase, if you will, that includes minority and women. But the focus today is really on best-in-class minority and women owned and led investment management firms. So if I use diverse managers or emerging managers, my real focus, and I may use them interchangeably, but it's about diversity, and particularly ethnic minority and women-led firms. Just a word about the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, headquartered in Battle Creek, Michigan, slightly more than $8 billion in assets, one of the largest private foundations in the United States, has a very specific mission of social equity and a focus on vulnerable children globally, and particularly around children of color. One of the interesting and unique things about the W.K. Kellogg Foundation is how integral diversity is to its fundamental operations. You can see from the quote there from the CEO, Lejeune Montgomery Tabron, that diversity is part of the DNA of the foundation. So it's not a project with the Kellogg Foundation, but it's an integral part of how the foundation thinks about itself, how it does business. It's a fundamental part of the board, the staff, its grantees, and vendors or business partners with whom it works. The next idea I'd like to focus on is the enabling context that allowed us to come to work with Kellogg Foundation. Many of the traditional barriers that Erica alluded to earlier didn't really apply with Kellogg in the context of this is a foundation that's deeply committed to diversity in all of its aspects of business. But even Progressive Kellogg found that when it began to look at its investment portfolio, they found a very interesting phenomenon. That's in fact that there really was no diverse talent managing their investment portfolio. And so I'm sure for Kellogg, but not unlike many foundations, most of the traditional focus around diversity has been around the 5% or so of grants that foundations typically have to disperse every year. So Much of the focus on diversity is around grants or grant making, secondarily perhaps to diversity of staffs and boards and leadership development around diversity. And all of these are great diversity initiatives, but oftentimes foundations have yet to connect the dot to the investment portfolio. So in many ways, their focus has been on the 5%, but Kellogg really focused on the 95%, where the bulk of its investment portfolio really existed. And so it began to think about this in a couple of different ways. It first started to develop a mission-driven investment program. So it tied its own investment initiatives with the kind of potential double bottom line impact it can get from also its mission. So it first started with MDI. But secondly, it started to look at its investment portfolio, and that really was a tone that came from the board and senior executives. So the point here is that leadership does matter. Leadership sets an enabling in context and an environment. And as you see from the paper where we interviewed one of the Kellogg trustees, that the key was for Kellogg to walk its talk, to the extent that it was having this conversation about diversity with grantees and other business partners. It ought to do the same thing with the investment portfolio. And so that was part of the enabling context. The other key part of that enabling context was the fact that the senior investment staff was curious and open to learning about the investment opportunity that's represented by including best-in-class, talented minority and women investment professionals. So they had an open mind, in part driven by some of the diversity training that exists within the Kellogg Foundation, but also some of the unique personal experiences that the CIO has had, Joel Wittenberg, when he was treasurer of the Kellogg Foundation. So maybe it's serendipity, but Joel had the opportunity to work with minority investment banks when he was treasurer at Kellogg and had a very positive experience. So that translated into him being open and willing to tap that network of relationships to find out, as he was now charged with leading a diversity investment initiative, who was out there in the space that could be useful as a business partner. And I think that led him to look at a variety of different business partner options, of which he chose to work with Progress as really an outsourced specialist to complement his work and that of the investment consultant. So let's talk a bit about the investment strategy that we're really working with Kellogg to initiate. It really starts with asset allocation. One of the critical threshold issues for any foundation or any institutional investor that's looking to implement this kind of targeted investment strategy is how will that strategy fit into the its larger asset allocation. Kellogg thinks about its allocation really in terms of three risk buckets: capital preservation, capital appreciation, and inflation hedge. So after some thinking about different models, and in the paper we really described three different models of potential execution around asset allocation, it decided to create a diverse investment strategy that mirrored its overall asset allocation. And so that led us to create, partnering closely with the Kellogg investment staff, a multi-asset class portfolio consisting of 8 what we think are best-in-class minority and women-led investment firms. That asset allocation specifically focused on U.S. And non-U.S. equities, fixed income, and also included hedged equities. Today that portfolio from the initial 8 is 6 managers, and we're right on the cusp of adding a 7th manager. But all of those asset classes are still represented in the portfolio. In terms of how we benchmark the overall portfolio performance, it's a custom-weighted benchmark, again reflective of the different asset classes. And we're pleased to say, although it's still a relatively young portfolio in terms of its vintage, that our performance has been above its benchmark, custom benchmark, since the inception. And that really, again, just begins to confirm what really is the bottom line of these kinds of targeted strategies and why we're advocating foundations to consider this targeted class. And that is really that there's a performance benefit here. And so for the rest of my time, I really want to focus on 3 key points. One is, what are the fiduciary and equity benefits from this kind of targeted investment strategy? What were some of the key lessons we have learned to date from working with Kellogg? And then finally, again, how foundations can get started in terms of further work in this area. But you can see here from the slide, first of all, I think investing with minority managers, we need to be very clear. This is not a social program, but an investment strategy, not unlike any other investment strategy, whether that be investing in emerging markets or small cap investing and what have you. This is an investment strategy that can primarily enhance investment returns. So the idea here is a investment opportunity that can help foundations to enhance and grow their endowments. Secondly, here is a new source of investment return opportunity. And again, from a fiduciary perspective, one should want to cast the broadest possible net. Certainly there is some diversification advantage from working with diverse firms. What we'll see, and what we see, whether it's in the traditional strategies or in some of the alternative strategies, is that most of the assets in this industry are concentrated and managed by just a handful of very large investment firms. And as we've seen from a variety of different examples, whether it is Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns during the 2008 and 2009 crisis, or whether it's more recently PIMCO, large firms have a level of risk many times it's not as apparent to us as we might think. And so the idea simply here is not either or, but it's and. That you should think of that institutional investors should think about diversifying their mix of investment managers with whom they work. We all know that diversification is a method for mitigating risk. And so utilizing diverse investment managers is a way to enhance diversification and create some competition, quite frankly, that benefits everyone. In terms of diversity, we know that these firms are a source of new investment ideas. I think it also allows foundations to align their mission. Many times it's focused on creating more opportunity with creating opportunity in the investment portfolio. So this idea of democratizing capital, really giving more participants an opportunity to both manage capital as well as to think about where capital is invested is an important concept, and that's little d democracy, but democracy is something our country and our industry understands. And then finally, these targeted strategies are a way of identifying long-term, potentially sustainable investment partners. So the idea of capacity is important. This becomes a way of identifying future capacity. And as Erica indicated, I think also creating a new class, if you will, of philanthropy partners. The next idea is really to focus on the key lessons, some of the key lessons that we learned. And certainly in this short time, we can't go into all the lessons that we've learned to date. But again, I think the first one is as I've mentioned, utilizing minority and women investment managers. And again, we're talking about best in class, so manager selection is key, is an investment opportunity that's not to be missed. As fiduciaries, one should think about casting the widest net. We know that there are return enhancement benefits. And then finally, this idea about foundations, many of which have been known as really innovators, not only in their programs, but also in the investment approaches that they take. They have different liquidity needs. So the idea of also including, in many cases, boutique or minority and women-owned investment managers as part of their overall mix is just one of those innovations, if you will, that foundations we would suggest should seriously consider. Another key lesson is, as I mentioned, senior leadership does set an enabling context and set a tone, and so it's important for foundation boards, certainly senior executives, whether that be CEOs or CIOs, to really be open to the idea of utilizing more diverse inputs. Certainly another lesson that we learned, and one of the more common objections that could arise, is that the question of whether or not there's an ample supply of minority investment talent available to foundations, and really ask that as a question. Is there an ample supply? And I think the resounding answer is yes. There is a robust universe of best-in-class talent led by minority and women-owned firms across all asset classes. In the Kellogg case study, we gave you an example of our research in the hedge fund area as an example of the kind of talent that exists both at emerging level, but more specifically at a targeted minority and women hedge fund area. And so that's just illustrative of the kinds of MWBE investment talent available in the hedge fund class. But I would also suggest in the broader alternative class, be that private equity or even real estate, there are ample minority and women-led investment options to review. Another key lesson was this idea that an outsourced specialist can successfully augment and really complement the foundation staff, again providing key specialized investment expertise. And that's really what Progress brought to this equation, working closely with Kellogg, who in turn continues to work with Cambridge as its general consultant, but really the specialized sourcing, understanding both the risk and opportunities of the strategy, certainly being able to actively monitor and coach firms through a series of business risks that they face. One of the things to keep in mind about emerging firms generally, and including minority and women-led investment managers, is that they're very experienced investment professionals, but not always as experienced growing businesses and scaling those businesses. So one of the active values that we add is the experience we've had of 24 years of working with literally hundreds of firms and helping to coach them through inevitable stages of organizational development. And so that's, again, a specialized resource, a specialized expertise and experience that typically general consultants nor investment staff, foundation investment staffs would really have. But the key point here is whether it's Progress, Cambridge, or the Kellogg investment staff, that we're utilizing the same types of diligence, the same performance benchmarks, the same risk metrics to evaluate minority and women-led investment firms as we do any other of the foundation's investment partners. So there's no special consideration or set-aside type of analytics that applies just to minority firms. In fact, it's the same high standard of excellence that you would apply to both minority and women-led investment firms as well as the general firms. The last idea is how foundations can get started in this area. Certainly educating leadership and staff around the investment opportunity. One of the interesting things, certainly from our own Progress firm experience, is for the past 25 years or so, public and corporate pensions have been leaders in this idea of investing with diverse investment firms. But foundations and endowments have really lagged. And the question is, why have they lagged? And in many cases, our experience so far has been perhaps lack of awareness of the opportunity. and particularly the investment opportunity that exists in this universe that is often under-researched and underutilized and overlooked, that we call minority and women-led investment firms. So it's understanding the benefits, being aware of the opportunity, the availability of talent, and then finally just being aware of the fact that there are models of success like the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, whether that be Silicon Valley Community Foundation or public and corporate pensions. I think another idea, Erica certainly mentioned that in terms of her comments, was really engaging general consultants. Engaging them by asking questions about their practices, their policies, their outreach efforts to include diverse talent in their ongoing searches that they're conducting for foundations, really holding them accountable. And that's one of the key takeaways, I think, from the Carson and Miller paper that ABFE co-sponsored that was published earlier this year, is that at Silicon Valley Community Foundation, the investment committee, as well as the senior leadership there, was able to really engage, in this case, Colonial Consulting, and hold them accountable for their own diversity. And as that consultant began to look at its own internal practices, they found some curious gaps, perhaps, in their levels of inclusion. I'm pleased to say that they have certainly improved their performance in this area over the past year or so, and looking forward to more improvements there. But the key is to engage consultants, to ask questions. Looking for opportunities to be more inclusive within the foundation's investment portfolio is another way to get started, and that's just simply having the will and being intentional about reviewing your asset allocation, reviewing external active manager needs, and just thinking about then, here are opportunities that we may be more inclusive. What's getting in the way as we review our policy, our practice, even our attitudes toward risk? What are the barriers here? And how can we remove these artificial barriers, many of which revolve around size of firm, many of which revolve around length of track record, that certainly our own experience with Progress and our experience with Kellogg has come to show us these aren't necessarily predictive of who can add investment value. And so thinking about barriers, really asking questions about, are they truly material or relevant to who can add value, I think, are important questions internally to ask. Finally, I think, again, there are expert resources that are available. Certainly ABFE and its Knowledge Center and the papers that ABFE has helped to sponsor are one source of information. Again, I humbly submit Progress Investment Management Company is a potential resource, and we're happy to talk or share our experiences with any foundation or endowment that's interested in this space, or consultant for that matter. I mentioned our experience with Kellogg. Certainly I know their staff and leadership and even board would be happy to share their experiences. I know that Dr. Carson and our senior investment team at Silicon Valley would be happy to share Silicon Valley Community Foundation's experience. So there are resources available. Just some closing thoughts. What we wanted to achieve with the Kellogg Foundation case study is really go a bit beyond some of the earlier papers and really provide a how-to, a set of best practices to really give life to and provide a practical way for a foundation to really get started in this space, or get started to implement and execute around a strategy of being more inclusive for diverse managers managing a part of its portfolio. So we wanted to provide a set of experiences that you could learn from, that you could potentially model yours after, or if the model doesn't fit, create your own solution that's customized to your unique requirements. But I think the point was we wanted to be able to demonstrate here's how at least one major foundation has gotten this done, and it's still in the execution phase of it, because we are not through in our work with Kellogg, and I know they have additional plans to even expand the work that we're already doing. Let me pause also and just thank the Kellogg Foundation for its own leadership, the opportunity they have afforded progress, and finally to its board and senior leadership, certainly board member Roderick Gillum and the Kellogg Foundation CEO Lejeune Montgomery Tabron and its CIO Joel Wittenberg for graciously agreeing to allow me to interview them in the context of this paper and really sharing their insights, information about their practices and beliefs, and then finally, hopefully, their model that can inspire other foundations to follow them. I'll just close with the quote that Lejeune provided, and it's just simply this: best in class, diverse, minority, women investment managers are truly an investment opportunity you don't want to miss. So again, thank you, Erica and ABFE, for co-hosting this webinar with us and affording me the opportunity to share a bit of our experiences. I would encourage anyone who's listening who wants to go deeper to just take a minute to read the paper. And certainly at Progress, we're willing to, this is our contact information, take any questions that you may have about that outside the context of the webinar. And now I think I'm certainly happy, and I know Erica will join me in answering any questions that our listeners may have.
Thank you so much, Thurman, for sharing your experience with the Kellogg Foundation and the work of Progress. Excuse me, normally my colleague Bianca Alston would read out the questions that have been submitted, but apparently there's quite a bit of construction at the office. So I'm going to do my best to read some of the questions that have been raised. One of them actually was for ABFE. The foundation fired their consultant for failure to include minority managers. How much is ABFE promoting this? And also, what can be done to get more minority consultants hired, both minority consultants and minority-owned consulting firms? So we aren't advocating for anyone firing. Excuse me, as an organization, we are advocating for more inclusive practices. We're advocating for consulting firms to operate differently, to think about their culture, not just, okay, are we tracking diverse managers, but really thinking about the culture of the firm, that their practices are starting to change, that their policies, that the way in which they approach this issue is changing. If a client, and let's be clear, that the consultants do work for their clients. If the client is making a request and it's not being met, then in any circumstance or any job, then they have the right to seek out an individual or an entity that will help them to achieve their goals. So unfortunately, if the foundation feel that that's not happening, or if these clients feel that that's not happening, then sometimes that's what it takes to get the change that we seek in this space. But we're not advocating for firing of the firms themselves. In terms of what could be done to get more consultants hired, again, lifting up the consultants that are out there. Of course, we have our industry partner category, so we need to know who those firms are as well, so that we can help identify who might be other resources that we can share as we share this information with our colleagues in the field.
Erica, if I might just add, I know that one of the things that at Silicon Valley for Community Foundation, for example, we recently had, began late last year, went through most of part of this year, a search for our consultant. And the kinds of questions around diversity that we're thinking about asking around managers, that foundations should be asking those same questions in terms of diversity practice, diversity personnel of their investment consultants. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, what kinds of policies do they have, what kinds of outreach to managers, but also the composition of the consultant staff, who principals are in the consulting firm. Those are the kinds of questions that consultants also ought to be held accountable for. We certainly did that as part of our investment committee oversight in the search process as we looked at consultants.
Perfect. Thank you. We did receive another question. How do you deal with consultants and trustees that may have a negative view of the concept of using minorities from Wall Street or using minority-owned firms? And I can, from our perspective at ABFE, we actually do a lot of work on racial equity grant making in terms of strategies, and also looking at foundations in their overall operations. And so we have a particular point of view, and the way in which we talk about issues of race, equity, inclusion with our clients from our own consulting work. We lead with performance, we lead with the data, and when the data is not easily identified, that's when we say, okay, if you can't even identify where the disparities are, then we need to take a step back. We look at root cause. So we have conversations about the systems of policies and not necessarily individual perspective. So we get out of the individually or the personally mediated issues around negative views, and we talk about, well, what does the data show? What does the performance show around a particular issue, not just in terms of investment managers, but also in terms of, whether it's grant-making strategies, hiring practices, et cetera. So that's how we approach it as an organization. Thurman, I don't know if you want to speak to that from your actual experience in this space on how you deal with, quite frankly, negative views of this issue.
Well, I think that the keys are education and fact-based discussion. And so, again, our own experience with Kellogg and certainly the performance of the portfolio of managers, 7 of our 8 initial managers had outperformed their respective performance benchmarks. That's the kind of data that I think begins to address, quote, negative attitudes. Also, in terms of data and research, I pointed out in the paper, and there's a footnote that alludes to there's a wealth of well-researched and documented academic work that just really confirms that there is in fact an investment performance advantage in many cases to utilizing small boutique and/or minority and women-led investment firms. And so fact-based education and engagement, I think, is the key here, and moving it away from personal attitudes and biases, and really focusing on the investment opportunity, the wealth of talent available, and the performance of that talent, and then really posing the question, given this kind of performance, shouldn't we want to include consideration of this talent as part of our portfolio? Because our goal is to grow the endowment so we can live out and fund, if you will, the foundation's mission. And that's really what we're talking about. This is not, certainly there's an equity component to this inclusion argument, but it's really fiduciarily based. In other words, it's based on sound investment principles, which really revolve around performance.
Okay. Thank you. This one, I think, would be directed to you, Thurman. What difference have you seen in the investment objectives of foundations versus public plan clients, for example, when it comes to looking for emerging managers?
Well, I think all institutional investors at heart have a common objective, and that is to grow the corpus, if you will, so that they can meet future obligations. For pension funds, it's a future obligation to the pension beneficiaries. In the foundation world, it's to grow endowments so that they can fund, if you will, the mission of the foundation in the future. But all of that revolves around simply the corpus growing at a rate hopefully greater than inflation, so that you can be able to fund kind of future obligations and or kind of mission. So there's more similarity than there is difference. I think one of the issues that distinguishes the pensions versus the foundations, while they both have an institutional commonality, they have some different liquidity needs. And so that often drives slightly different asset allocation. What you see in the foundation world is this idea of taking a little bit more active risk in their portfolios, and so there may be a larger asset allocation to alternative strategies since they don't have as big a current liquidity need as the pensions. So the foundations may end up investing more in say, private equity, hedge funds, real estate relative to pensions. But again, I think in the context of the issue that we're talking about, one of the points again that I want to emphasize that there is high quality talent, minority and women-led investment professionals across not only traditional asset classes, but the alternative space as well. And so again, some of our hedge fund universe data that we used in the paper is really trying to respond to that potential asset allocation difference. And I hope that helps to address that question.
Okay, thank you. And I can say that after the webinar, we will share a resource list which has a few papers that have been out, have been circulating for a couple of years. One is the Barclays report on hedge fund performance. The other is from NAIC, National Association of Investment Companies. And they're looking at private equity firms. So we'll get that information out to participants following. So the next question, again to you, Thurman, is how did Progress determine which minority or women-owned firms to recommend to the foundation, and what is Progress's role in the relationship to foundation staff and the ongoing investment consultant in deciding which firms to hire?
Erica and listeners, as you may know, we have a very experienced investment team, and joining me today is our Deputy Chief Investment Officer, Jose Balaguet. So I'm going to let Jose answer this question about how we sourced and selected the managers that we use for the Kellogg portfolio. Jose?
Thanks. Thanks, Thurman. And, you know, our sourcing and selection process is certainly consistent with how we source and select managers for all of our institutional clients, including the Kellogg Foundation. We think it's a rigorous process. You know, it focuses on the same set of areas, characteristics and attributes that you all use in selecting managers for your foundation. I'd emphasize the point that Thurman had made earlier. What we were very mindful of was Kellogg's asset allocation. We were certainly interested in the diversity component, but what we also tried to do is find, in Joel's words, small firms that had really great upside opportunity. And that oftentimes meant sourcing at perhaps some firms that were smaller within the emerging manager group. Also looking for ideas that were different and unique from a strategy viewpoint. So those were other considerations that we had in sourcing Kellogg's portfolio. The idea that we're also focused on minority and women-owned firms certainly presented a set of opportunities for a subset of our group. But again, I would emphasize, you know, a very vigorous due diligence process, something that an asset allocation and strategies that were consistent with Kellogg's asset allocation and what they needed, and this idea for really getting in early and taking advantage of a firm's upside potential.
I might also add one of the core competencies here is our bottoms-up manager research. And so we have our own proprietary database and it's been built over the last 24 years, and that's in traditional strategies, meaning public equity, U.S. equity, as well as non-U.S. and fixed income, as well as more recently hedge funds. So I think one of the things one of the value adds that we provided to Kellogg was a more specialized kind of manager research than perhaps its general consultant could offer them. And so we have an investment team of 11 professionals, so manager research is at the core of what we do. So as Jose described, we just went to our own database and was able to identify some best-in-class, we thought, managers that exemplified the characteristics that Jose described. And then, the Kellogg Foundation is a hands-on investor, so we were able to present names and really interact with the staff and allow them to underwrite our decisions by having their own individual interviews with those managers and then making collaborative decisions. So that's how we identified the managers. But as Jose described, we use our typical diligence process, which focuses on people, which focuses on the process, which focuses on the infrastructure of the firm as well, and that's at a very high level.
Thurman, if I might add one other thing, and maybe this is just an idea, as you think about using partners potentially to source ideas and wondering what the real opportunity set for you is in the emerging manager and MWBE space. In Kellogg's instance, they had specific strategies in mind that they were looking to fund. And it might have fallen under, one of those specific strategies might have fallen under a broader asset class. So for example, they were interested specifically in funding an intermediate fixed income strategies. Now one of the things, or a global tip strategies. Now if you search the typical consultant databases, you might not yield a lot of firms, MWBE firms, that have those specific strategies. But what we were able to bring to the partnership with Kellogg was the fact that we knew MWBE firms that had previous experience with this product and certainly had the kind of alpha engine and resources so that they could actually run this particular strategy. And our familiarity with the manager and the type of research that we were able to present to Kellogg helped make the case where Kellogg was willing to be an early investor in some of these strategies. Now, the entire, this would be just for a subset of the strategies, but again, it's just this expertise and the dialogue that we were able to have with Kellogg that allowed us to meet their needs.
Okay. We did get a couple more questions, and one was, did Kellogg beat its benchmark net of all investment and consultant fees? And how much is Kellogg monitoring evidence of new ideas linked to better performance?
Could you repeat the second part of the question?
Sure. How much is Kellogg monitoring evidence of new ideas linked to better performance? And if we need a little context, I'm going to ask that whoever submitted that question to provide a little bit more. But we can certainly ask that did Kellogg beat its benchmark net of investment fees?
I think the simple answer is yes to date, but again, it's a relatively young portfolio. And I think in terms of the second part of the question, there is a quarterly review cycle, if you will, and reporting cycle that we have in our engagement with Kellogg. So they are at least quarterly engaging with us, reviewing both the investment performance of the managers, reviewing the organizational health of those managers. And in reviewing the organizational health, they're not only looking at the products that they have funded from the existing managers, but what new products, investment products, those firms may be offering in the marketplace. So there's also a part of our work with Kellogg which enables us to present even new ideas beyond the funded manager ideas to them. So it's a very collaborative, iterative process, but it's a rigorous review that we're engaged with Kellogg on a very periodic basis. So it's in that context that they're constantly looking for new ideas, new managers, and they're often making referrals to us of managers that contact them for us to do further diligence on. So it's a real collaborative and iterative process around new ideas and monitoring the performance of the existing portfolio.
Okay, thank you. We did get a question, how much of a set aside would help drive this work forward? Could you do it with $10 million, or should the consideration be more in the $100 million range? So from the ABFE perspective, we want movement, period. So from our perspective, I think being intentional and making a move is what we would like to see, and I think that ranges for the size of the foundation. So obviously, if it's a larger foundation that has even that range of allocations that it can make, the more the better. But we want to see foundations being intentional and moving on this issue. Thurman, I will let you take it from your perspective, both as trustee of Silicon Valley Community Foundation, but also through the lens of working with Kellogg.
Well, let me start with the Kellogg experience first, because although they have the portfolio now represents $111 million, it didn't start there. In other words, it started smaller, and they funded periodically based on their own cash needs, liquidity needs, etc. And so I think so I want to be clear that people don't think Kellogg started with a $100 million set aside, if you will, but it had a target in mind. And as we recommended potential manager ideas, and it had an overall asset allocation goal in mind. But as we presented manager ideas and as they had liquidity, they continued to fund. And actually, it took about a year or so to get to the current target funding level. So the foundation that wants to start with $10 million, I think, is an adequate starting point. I hope that's not the ceiling. But I think that, once you start there and get some performance, then just like any other investment strategy based on your needs and performance, the logic would suggest that you would add to that strategy if it's performing and you think that that's an allocation area that can lend future value for your foundation. So you don't necessarily need to have $100 million to get started. You can get started with 10. Kellogg funded over a period of time. Key is the commitment to the undertaking. I think that's the more critical key, and I think that's consistent with the ABFE view.
Absolutely. Someone asked a question, and I think this was directed to ABFE. What about minority brokers? And at this stage, we haven't taken that on explicitly. I know that is definitely an area that public pensions have undertaken, but we have not. Thurman, I don't know if you want to speak to that and the ways in which minority brokers can be brought into this conversation as well.
Well, certainly, as you indicate correctly, the utilization of minority brokers has been championed, and particularly in the public pension arena, and it's a practice, it's a policy that we engage in, and so we certainly advocate the utilization of minority brokers consistent with best price and best execution standards. I think in this foundation area, to the extent that foundations are rebalancing portfolios and make use of transition managers, or just to the extent that they are managing assets internally, that they become potential opportunity areas for minority brokers. So there is a seat at the table for consideration of minority brokers. I think for ABFE, it's a matter of just beginning to understand the entire area better, and then figuring out how to include that as this dialogue matures.
Agreed. I think that was it for the questions that we've received. If anyone wants to send a final question, I know that we held this to time until 3:30, but if there are no more questions, then we can start to wrap up. So I'll give folks a minute or two while I thank Thurman for his time not just on the webinar, but also the commitment to drafting the case study and working with us to get that distributed. Thank you for your advocacy as a board member of a foundation, the biggest community foundation in the country, and that matters. Thank you all for being a part of the conversation today. Excuse me, and please know again that we will be sending out resources following the webinar. So if there was anything that you would like to receive specifically, please feel free to reach out. Bianca, if you could flip to the next slide, which has my email address. So if you have any questions or would like to follow up to get more information, please feel free to reach out to me directly at edavies@abfe.org, and I will happily get that information to you. So with that, again, thank you, Thurman, and thank you for the team at Progress for being present. Thank you to everyone who has participated, and we've got a lot of work to do, so I know we need to stay with this. Thurman, I don't know if you had any closing comments.
No, again, just to thank ABFE for your leadership and work in this area. Thank our listeners for joining us today for the conversation. Thank you for the thoughtful questions. And just finally, the Kellogg case study white paper is available on the Progress website. And again, that's www.progressinvestment.com.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good day, and we'll make recordings of the webinar available within the next and following weeks. So thanks again, and have a great day. Take care.